All right, all right, all right. Now let's get to business. So we're gonna start with the Lord's Prayer, and I'm gonna start talking some very deep stuff, and it might become a series. But let's get to the Lord's Prayer first. My Father in heaven, honored be thy name. May thy kingdom come. May thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses, as forgive those who trespass against us, and lead us on the righteous path, and guard us from the evil. In your name we pray. Amen. And be with us always, Father. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. Shalom, shalom, family. So I just want to talk about something. So fair use today. I'm gonna be talking about something very deep, and I'm gonna be using a lot of sources to bring those things out. I want to first make this statement: absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That's very important. Let me say that one more time. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What does that mean? It means just because something's not seen at that time doesn't mean that it's not true. One of the biggest things that we see in the world today is many conspiracies. Now, the thing about a conspiracy is something that happens that's contrary to something that may, in a sense, be controversial, right? Come from the sense of, conspiracy, right? It's controversial, a conspiracy. But the thing about ancient conspiracies, one thing about history we can start learning in history, especially when it involves major things like, for example, wars or peoples or groups, we can look at different sources and see what's all around that time to prove if a statement or a conspiracy is said true. That's very important, and that's what we're going to do today. The reason why is because not many people probably know about this page, but I've been watching this page for a while. Ahau, he's been speaking some things, some really interesting, deep things, but he came out with two videos, and he used sources that I was already aware of, and I know that these sources are actually very bad, but he ended up using some very modern sources and acting like he had something brand new. Now, the reason why I'm going to talk about that is because it's actually a major thing. I didn't even know it was a major problem until I started seeing it in the background more. So these two videos he had came out with basically concluding a very interesting topic. I think it's very important that we talk about it very thoroughly. So first, let me start off like this. I think it's important to get a summary of understanding because what I'm going to display today is a little understanding of history. I have a note, but I don't think I'm going to get through it all in one day. I don't want to go through it all in one day because it's going to be very detailed, but I'm going to quickly summarize some things and some problems. Now, quick conclusion. I'm just going to go to one video that summarize it, and I'm going to summarize it with this one video, and throughout the week and throughout time, I'm going to talk about this note. Matter of fact, I might as well summarize it while I'm scrolling on it. So what I'm going to talk about in this note is going to be the historicity of the biblical narrative at its original start. And that many church followers and many people all around of different places, I'm talking India, I'm talking all the way in uh, the lands of Egypt, I'm talking all the way in basically where you get lower areas like Ethiopia. We get a lot of different Christian writers who are scholarly that write of different things that are happening all over the world. And we're talking first century sources. And that's very important because we're going to be talking about some of those first and second century sources, how they actually attest that they spoke to the first disciples, that many of them actually are disciples from those disciples, and then disciples they have that's going to be bringing forth the truth down the line. And we're talking, first, second century in connection, right? Everyone has the same story, and these are not all Romans, right? We're going to talk about that and some other misconceptions that go on and different things like that. And different groups, different major groups that are there at that time that we can actually contest to and know that they are there. Different things that happen, right? We're going to touch on saints that were in India, and we're talking historical sources, right? Not just the some people have just that one book, that book of Thomas, but actual real sources where they actually talk about that there was individuals like Thomas that did come over there and teach those things, and there were church fathers that were already speaking of Christianity early on at that time in that land, and it's all connected from Arabia. We're going to talk about how also Paul, which I already spoke about, Paul went to Arabia and others went through different areas from these areas. It wasn't just a lot of times when people see the Gospels, they know about these areas, but they forget that there's also historical documents of Paul going to these areas and then individuals going to these areas. And then also remember in the book of Acts, we get them going to Ethiopia, which is over here. Down here, we also get some that go into this area of Egypt. So we're going to have major connection in these areas, not just in one small area. The reason why it's important is because I'm going to show a summary video and I'm going to talk about something very important. But I think this summary video is going to summarize it very importantly, right? Like I talk about in Ethiopia, we can talk about early times of Christians, right? Early in the sources, because basically what the individual has concluded that basically Christianity was something that developed with basically Titus Flavius Josephus, which is a name he got later on, and Titus Flavius Vespasian, which is an emperor, and also a connection with another one who we're going to talk about with Piso and different things like that. We're going to get into and talk about the errors of that idea of thinking that Christianity could have developed such at a late stage with all the influence that it had at the early stages. It would make no sense to even come with that conspiracy to say that Christianity developed from the Romans. And even in the way that he twists to try to make Vespasian also Josephus and then make Josephus match with another fellow, we're gonna touch on it because all these books, once you see I got sources from the authors themselves and statements that they made. I'm going to connect those things and talk about those things because it's very major, this topic, because it can lead people astray when you're trying to say, because let me get down to something. Let me just go down and talk about this one piece because I really want to get to the summary and talk about this little summary that I think is a good way to summarize it and put it all in a summary real fast. I think it's better that we summarize a little idea because what he is showing is not something new. It's not new books. It's not new material. It's not something that people didn't know. It's things that people knew over time and they were debunking for a long time. They were already talking about this thing. I'm just gonna make sure I scroll to the bottom first, make sure that this was something that we people already knew. Many people already knew about it. But once we start looking at ancient sources in that time, we know that that was a conspiracy. That's one of those things that many people knew, and it was something that scholars don't take serious at all. But we're gonna talk about this. I want to go to one on. In fact, I'll just type it down and talk about it real fast from here. I just want to talk about this thing, or my thing is like frozen. So that YouTube page just froze like that. I'll just leave that alone. Let me actually open it up here. Should it be hard to find Caesar Messiah? And then you just put debunk because there's many different ones on it, but no, nothing really touched on it that well. Besides, I'll show you this one right here. This is one that just touched on it right here.
Caesar's
Now, I want to talk about this real fast just to summarize it because we're gonna go through the whole history. The reason why is because I think it's important to know that the first century sources, multiple first century sources from different locations, contest to the first century Christians. Also, there's other people that contest to the first century Christians, and we're talking external sources, right? Not just talking Josephus in the Bible. We're talking external sources, right? And different locations all around the world. But first, let's get an understanding. This is the simplest breakdown of this, and then throughout the week, we're going to break down this whole thing.
Messiah was a book published by a dot-com businessman named Joseph Atwill in 2005. Last year, he released a documentary based on the book, and everyone is talking about it all of a sudden because Atwill put out the world's most misleading press release for his film screening in London. Richard Dawkins then retweeted the press release, even though he said he didn't endorse the theory, and now this 8-year-old theory is news again. Thank you, Richard Dawkins. The basic premise of Caesar's Messiah is that the Roman imperial family, the Flavians, invented Jesus by using the Jewish historian Josephus and presumably other people to write the Gospels after Rome defeated the Jews in 70 AD. The idea was to make the militant Jewish rebels accept a peaceful Messiah and thereby give Rome less trouble.
All right, all right, all right. I think that whole time my thing was like not acting right. All right, so let's address this real fast. Yep, Peter, Karen Christian, that's right. That's right. There's certain things that we need to understand when we talk about these things. And the major thing that we need to understand is that the gospel itself, right, is dated in history, right? When I say dated in history, we're going to talk about multiple examples. One of the biggest ones I just want to start with, I think is one of the most important, is the historicity of the conflict with the Gnostics and the Christians, which the Christians they would write so much like they would have war in word, right? I want to show you something. This is a really interesting video. This is the thing about channels. A lot of channels they can have a lot of good information, but you got to also evaluate the person themselves because even the person on this channel said himself he's a master student, not a master teacher, right? That's very
Ever
important.
since the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in
Now let me show you something from here. I think it's very important. Let me just show something at a timestamp at 1320, right here. Let me show you something of what was going on early in that time. So a little bit of information back 25. Obviously, I don't agree with the imagery, but it's all about the historicity of the story, right? The person right here is just trying to make it entertaining, but the details of the words that they're saying, the historicity of it is accurate. You got to hear what he's saying when he talk about the connection of these early church fathers, multiple different church fathers, and this individual right here that he's going to talk about, we don't know what he looked like. And remember, these later pictures are later pictures. Um, but we do understand that the early church fathers themselves, we got to understand that they themselves were there recording stuff, writing it, and sending it out. Right? That's very important. But
our
let's
old
hear
friend
this.
Irenaeus, a bishop of Lyon, who very harshly attacks what he considers to be deviant forms of Christianity. In his famous treatise, Detection and Overthrow of Gnosis, falsely so called, sometimes known simply as Against the Heresies, which was written around the year 180, he calls out the Gnostic heresies, or school of thought, and all those inspired by them, like the Valentinians, as having strayed from true Christianity and created a demonically inspired abomination. He traces all of these false teachings back to a supposed teacher or magician called Simon Magus, or Simon the Magician, and that all their claims to gnosis, or true knowledge, was in fact false. Keep in mind that the word heresy simply means a school of thought at this time, and not necessarily heresy as it is used today. In fact, it is due to people like Irenaeus and their writings that that word came to have the meaning that it has today. That's a very interesting side note. In any case, Irenaeus clearly isn't a fan of the Gnostics, and yet his writings has been one of the main sources that we've had for their teachings and practices for most of history. And when we actually read Irenaeus' reports, it seems to align pretty well with the writings by the Gnostics themselves, which we now have since the discovery at Nag Hammadi, which shows that even though he was a polemical writer who wanted to discard the Gnostics as heretics and his whole argument was that they were wrong, basically, it seems that what he wrote wasn't entirely untrue and that we can rely to some degree on what he has to say. So in spite of his polemical nature and the fact that he was so critical, Irenaeus still remains one of our main sources and most trustworthy sources to this day. Irenaeus.
All right, so now who am I showing you? So what's important is we're showing the early church fathers, people who now what's important is it's their theology, it's their what they understand. How do we know that Christians exist before that time? Because their belief system, right, Christianity, is established by these individuals individually, right? This is just one person. So this person, he's speaking to the Gnostics and saying, your doctrine is not matching with the doctrine of Christ, the original teachings from the disciples that we got in that time is what he's actually standing so in defensive that it has to be as now think about it. If it was a made up story, why would he care if there's a small alteration? That's very important. If there's a small alteration, it's already a lie. It's already a lie. So what's the point of any alterations? he's standing there still saying to these different individuals, because if you know about the Gnostic gospel, the thing about the Gnostics, what they would do is that they would outwardly seem Christian, but a lot of their doctrine internally, detailedly scans offward and start going to more mythicism and different stuff like, um, basically, like heaven is a bunch of different beings as in one, but it's all weird. It's all weird. It's not right. If in this little video that I'm showing you, it's going to be in the description, but we're going to go over these things in more detail. But what's important is the Gnostics contest that they exist very early on, because the people that were dealing with them are very early writers defending earlier writing. That's very important. That's going to give us some information, that information that was spreading of the exact information that we have today was being defended in that time against a people that was seemingly had the same, because even the Gnostics papers, the Gnostic information, the Gnostic people, their paper and their documents are known to be first century stuff. That's very important. But still, we see this early, late first, second century writer writing and contesting to defend the gospel to the exact T of what was written. Now, that's just a small piece. That's just a small piece is what I'm just showing there. But let's look at a little another piece, because on here is actually a few different little treasures. Let's go to over here. Let me go to something here, and I'm gonna go right here, and I'm gonna let it play real fast.
And information about this topic has been hard. The only sources we had for most of history were those written by the heresiologists, so pro-Christians or later writers like Irenaeus, for example, who wrote very critically about the Gnostics and wanted to sort of deem them as heretics. But in 1945, the monumental discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt revolutionized our understanding of these groups. The Coptic texts found in the library contained writings by the so-called Gnostics themselves, some of which had been mentioned in the works of the heresiologists previously. And since then, we've been able to get a much more comprehensive and nuanced understanding about the ideas and practices of various early Christian communities and schools of thought. Despite this, however, there is disagreement among scholars on how this Gnosticism should be categorized. Some have opted for a very universalist approach to Gnosticism, which views Gnosticism as such as a wider religious or spiritual intellectual movement.
So that's important, just to get an understanding that the Gnostic gospel that was going on at that time was battling with the gospel that was canonized at that time. That's very important. As this gospel was being defended in the lands of Egypt, I want to go to one right here. I'm going to show you now in the lands of Egypt. It's recorded that the gospel was canonized before the Council of Nicaea. That's very important, because a lot of people think the people only knew about the gospel in the time of Nicaea, but actually they knew about the canonization of it early on.
The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library was so important for historians, not only because we discovered previously unknown works of literature, but it also gave us a glimpse into the social dynamics of early Christianity. It shed some light on what anti-heresy writers like Irenaeus were trying to accomplish. To illustrate what I mean, let's examine the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius. In 367 CE, Athanasius published a letter to the churches in Egypt, instructing them which books they're allowed to read. He is the first Christian author to apply the term canon to the same 27 books that most Christians today use in their New Testament. Author to apply the term canon to the same 27 books that most Christians today use in their New Testament. He wrote, "In these books alone, the teaching of piety is proclaimed. Let no one add to or subtract from them." He goes
Now, what's important is who is this individual now, right? Who is this individual? Now let's take a look at this individual. Now he's actually in Alexandria. Alexandria, that's gonna be in a lower area, right? That's gonna be where you see Egypt, right? It's gonna be very important. So this individual, right? He was defending the faith. That's very important, and he was one of the individuals that would be mentioned as in canonizing the biblical narrative. Now, what's interesting is with this church, you can actually keep going backwards and see who all was there, right? You can go to the progenitor, right? Let's keep going back. Just keep getting a little idea, right? You can keep going back and see who else. There's another one. Now, it's important to understand early on, if you see the word Pope or the word Catholic, you got to know the historicity behind those words, right? The word Catholic actually means universal, right? And a lot of times when you think Pope, a lot of times you got to remember they still had bishops. And we think about the gospel, they was given bishops and deacons, right? They had bishops and deacons over certain parts, right? That's very important. So we're just going back. You can keep going and getting different documents from people that witness, right? Witness themselves that they were there. And you can get more historical documents on different things that were happening at that time, right? How long it persisted, how long it continued on, and how many different writers and different people were there. Getting almost really close to the first century, you can see what's going on there. We're getting at more earlier. Look how early we're getting. And this is just one place, right? We're just talking about one place. It's over here in Egypt, right? We're going back, see what's going on here. And we could talk about the historicity behind Egypt. What's important is that the people in Egypt, they themselves there was a lot of Jews there. We know this because we got historical documents that talk about many of the Jews, many of them was in Egypt. We know this without a doubt. Now, this one, what you see right here, you can see we're talking about this individual, right? He was one of the individuals right after Mark, right? This little church here was actually established, and it was remaining for a long time. And we're going to go into detail. We're going to go into detail on these things throughout the week, because I think the major thing that we need to understand is that many Jews were in many different areas, and we can get different saints who are what's the word I'm looking for? Not just in the areas of Rome, but different saints that were in different areas like Ethiopia and stuff and things like that. Like, for example, here's one about Ethiopia.
Now going on 22 years of my life.
I'm going to jump ahead.
On the good ship Jesus, the grace of God, and the Holy Mary, the name of their slave ships, made us a totally different Christians. We want to deal with that. Here we see the Kandake's treasure is reading a Bible. And this is around 42 to 52 AD. And he's reading the Bible, and after he gets information from Philip, he goes south back into the land of Nubia, or to the Christian nation of Meroe. Now that tells us that Africans along the banks of the Nile were already Christians before Romans were Christians, because this is around 42 to 52 AD. Philip, he goes south back into the land of Nubia, or to the Christian nation of Meroe. Now that tells us that Africans along the banks of the Nile were already Christians before Romans were Christians, because this is around 42 to 52 AD. What
So it's solidly known that there were Christians all the way in Africa before Jerusalem fell, right? Before 70 AD. So that's very important. We could talk about the spread, the timing, and all those different things, and how it continued growing down there. Because we can talk about the churches, certain churches that were already established down there. They talk about different churches that were already established down there, right? It's very important. It is believed in Egypt that Christianity was first brought there by Saint Mark, right? One of the writers of the Bible, in the year 42 AD, right? See what's going on? And that individual also have some, what you saw there was some actual sources pointing out that Christianity, the belief of Christ and the way and the order of it, was in the land of Africa before the Romans even got a chance to make a plot. So what's important to understand that the gospel, right, is a pure message. Is a pure message that spread through all types of different areas. We could talk about in India, right? India in the early times of India, right here, just to get an idea of it.
The colonial history of Chennai began here at Fort St. George, the first British fortress in India. Established A new worldview perspective entered India with the arrival of the gospel in the 1st century AD. Thomas was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. According to the Bible, he was the disciple that doubted who Jesus really was until he experienced the resurrection firsthand. After Jesus commissioned his followers to take the gospel to the ends of the earth, Thomas packed his bag and traveled east. Along the way, he shared the message of Jesus Christ with anyone who crossed his path. According to ancient documents, Thomas shared the gospel with the rugged highlanders who lived in the mountains between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. He also ministered in the court of King Gondophares, ruler of most of modern Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Clearly, the man once known as Doubting Thomas no longer had doubts, as he preached the gospel to entire kingdoms in the East.
So it's a really interesting thing, you know, when you see these things. We had did a video on this about the evidence of the gospel, and that's one thing about the videos. I usually make like a little playlist, but we did do a video on basically some of the early evidence of Christ, and some of the, I mean, the earliest evidence of Christ, right? We did a video on the most earliest evidence of Christ. I just want to show you something there. Did Thomas
I
really
believe
go?
that the
Did Thomas really
nucleus, the
go
core.
up there? Did he really go all the way up to Armenia and through Syria and stuff like that? Right? You would think if he did, you'll see examples of Christian groups in that area. We do got examples of Christian groups in that area. I'm going to show you a timestamp.
Now let's talk about non-Roman mentionings, and one of the most interesting ones is a letter written by Mara Bar Serapion of Syria. To give you a little bit of context, at this time the writer was in prison and he was writing this letter to his son. He says, "What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burying Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, the Jews ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the teachings of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given." Now, even though on this letter there is no mention of the word Christos or the name Christos, or should we say title, Messiah, it is still interesting because he does call him the King of the Jews, which we know was not only an expression that was not used by the Christians, but it was an expression that is linked to what was written on top of the cross of Jesus with the letters in Ri, which translate Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judae, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews.
All right, so
But again,
I'm
beyond
gonna pause this real fast and go to here. So that's what I want to do. I want to just go over the information on this note because I think it's just important to know the how deep it gets when we look at the historicity of these things. Because we're going to first start with Paul, and we're going to talk about where did Paul go, because there's a writing in the Bible in 2 Corinthians 11:32-33, right? If Paul, now what's important that Paul is an individual that others are also writing about him. That's what makes Paul also a special individual. A lot of people, they think the only place you find the information for Paul is in the Bible. You do get the information of Paul in the Bible, but there are external sources that talk about Paul. We'll talk about that too, but we're going to talk about how Paul actually goes to Arabia. He goes to Arabia and he prophesies to individuals in the lands of Arabia. We know that many become Christians because it's recorded in history, some of the things that happened with Paul. Um, and that's what we're going to do, just go over a little bit of his history and talk about these things. But today I just want to just basically summarize and talk about what I'm going to do and what we're going to do. Just throughout the week, we're going to talk about the historicity of the biblical narrative and the separation of historical figures. We're going to talk about certain historical figures like Nero, right? Tiberius Caesar, different individuals, Josephus, and different ones like that, and how we know that they are their own peoples. At times we can get recordings of different peoples who are their own peoples, especially during the time of Nero. The time of Nero, the fall of Nero, when Nero falls, and then we get basically what happens is called the year of the four emperors, where basically four emperors are going at it, and for anyone to consider that a conspiracy of any sort can happen at a time such as that time would be just laughable, because Rome was not even united in that time. So for them to have a conspiracy to unite and to get everyone into some type of order, they wasn't even united themselves. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about some of the different individuals, like um, Titus Flavius Vespasian, and getting a little understanding on his history, who he is, how do we know who the separation between him and when he meets the individual Yosef ben Mattanyahu, who later he gets and he changes his name, right? Because we also get writings that write about Josephus in other places. That's also important too. We get different writings with different emperors and different individuals, but we got to be careful of certain things, right? And I'm going to talk about certain books directly, certain names directly, certain things directly, to talk about basically some of the confusion that's going on when not knowing history, right? So we're going to go over some very deep things. I want to go over it throughout the week, but I was thinking of going it today, but I thought to myself, it's better if we break this down, go about it piece by piece, and talk about these things and the historicity of it. But it's not a long note. It's not really a long note, but it's a note that's important to go over. It's something that's important to go over piece by piece, because this is the type of things that we need to talk about. I think we need to talk about certain things like this. So I guess today I'm going to just keep it as a summary and just give these very important points that when we think about the first century events, right, even Paul's movements, that was something. In fact, let me open this called Galatian, because I want to talk about something on this as well that we had talked about. Because what I was talking about earlier when I was saying Paul went into Arabia, I was talking about this when I was talking about basically the history of Arabia, right? Arabia wasn't always Islamic. It was actually Christian before it was Islamic. Now, before it was Christian, it is also known that it was something before it was that. You can also find that. Let me actually go to a little video here. They talk about it in multiple places, but here's a nice little, I think, video. So right here. So Arabia before Islam. This one's really interesting because they break down, what was going on in Arabia and different individuals that were moving
place
about.
through which caravans would flow, as well.
They also talk about.
Yvonne Grunewald.
Let me actually go to it over here. I'll just play it on this. That's here. What he's actually just saying, to get the timestamp, because they also play, but on this I had played it quietly. They also show where Paul goes into Arabia, right? And I'm going to make sure that's is telling the truth. Not just that, but we have historical evidence showing that he's telling the truth. Here's a little expression with an external source that talks about Paul's ministry. Watch what it says here.
As early as the 1st century AD.
All right, I just wanted to know that timestamp so I can go to it on here. So it's 11. Right here. So I'm going to show you. So, okay, it's going to show you, right? It's going to be an external, and you can see the sources, because we're going to look at the sources. We're going to look at all these things in detail. That Paul himself was a person that existed, and his existence is recorded in history. His effect on the Arabians, Thomas' effect on the upper coast up here, and all the way to India is known, and Paul's effect to Arabia to all the way to Greece. That's why you get believers all the way over here and believers in Greece. And obviously you got Mark and all the other saints that were over in these areas, which we see in the book of Luke and different writings. We see that they were all in these areas, right? And that's also important to know. That's where the promised land is. That's another subject that I'm going to go into that many people that think about the promised land, they end up putting the promised land whatever they want to put it. They just want to put it in America. They want to put it in Africa. The promised land is where the promised land is. There's no doubt where the promised land is. If we have to accept where it is, and we can find evidence of different, we can find real Israel in the area of the promised land. I guarantee you that we can find the people around this area, no doubt. We don't have to stretch the narrative to try to fit it for anything. We just got to let the narrative be. There's a lot of people that's misinterpreting writings by, like, for example, this individual, I'm going to show it. This individual has a video. I think I closed it, but he has a video where he talks about that the people are from America, right? Now, the problem with it is that if you constantly, I just see his videos, I kept seeing him constantly talk about the Canaanites and the Baal and stuff like that, and connecting that land and saying, see, since the Canaanites are there, that had to be, Israel, and connected with other pieces. But the problem with it was quite obvious that the Canaanites, is known that the Canaanites had traveled very far. That's one thing about the Canaanites. They stretched from the land of what the Phoenicians were all the way to the lands of Greece, settled in different areas, and it's contested with many different findings, ancient findings that contest to it. But what he does is he finds places. I want to find his little video on his playlist. Let me grab this video directly on his playlist so I can talk about it while I'm showing it. Let me see if it's this one. No, it's not. See, he has some. I used to watch his channel because he has. Don't get me wrong. He has some sources, but his interpretation sometimes of the sources are extremely flawed. Is what I'm saying. Like, for example, some of the American one. I'm gonna go to this one, if I can remember. Where is that? I gotta find the one where he talks about Jerusalem. He basically talks about that Jerusalem is a place in America, and you gotta look at what he's trying to say it is. And what's interesting is a lot of people do this problem. They forget that Jerusalem is defined very detailedly, right? From the stones, from the altar. Like, for example, that was one altar that someone was talking about, that it was like, well, the saints did cannabis, and they had this little altar. They said, oh, that's the temple. We knew that wasn't the temple because, one, the battle. There's multiple battles in a certain area that has to be known there, and not just that. The way this temple was designed, you can't put a sacrifice on worked stone. That was worked stone. Worked stone means stone that you take a tool and hit. In the biblical narrative, it said you cannot offer a sacrifice on a worked stone. If you take a tool and put it to a stone, you defiled it, right? You defiled it. So as soon as you see worked stone and any offering of a worked stone, you know that can't be Jerusalem, because Jerusalem actually had, basically, you'll pick up the stone and you'll build an altar with the stones. You wouldn't work it. So a lot of times you'll see worked stones. But he has his place, that has clearly worked stones and different things like that. And not just that, if you get a chance to ever see some of the ideas that he comes up with for the place and what it might have been, it's no doubt that when you look at it, that can't be the city. In fact, far from it, because of the amount of information in the wars is absolutely laughable to try to put Jerusalem in America. No, there's no one who really understands the geographic order of the biblical narrative to even make the biblical narrative word for word fit, to try to make it fit anywhere else but Israel. I'm talking the land of the Levant and the land where you actually have the area going down into Egypt, right? Into Ethiopia, which is constantly, that area is constantly documented throughout different times, right? Different, in fact, that's what we'll talk about too, about how accurate the biblical narrative actually is, because did a video a while back about how accurate the biblical narrative is. And when I say accurate, I'm talking every king when I say king, when they talk about a king from Assyria, that king from Assyria can be verified that king was there at that time and contested by the stones that's found of them. There's multiple different individuals that's like that, and we'll talk about that. That's more ancient. How can we verify where is America? Different things like that, and how can we verify where is Israel? Right? Where is the land of the Levant, and where is the land that Babylon marched through to get to Egypt, and then go back up to it and settle there, and also take in the all the nations that's named by name by their nation and their order. That's very important. It's a hermetic collaboration of truth that has to be seen, not just read. You can't just read a bunch of books and say, "Oh, this is what it means," and that's what it means. And I'm gonna talk about that real fast. Matter of fact, let me show you what I mean. Let me show you what I mean here. It's like it's inconsistent, and I'm gonna show you what it means by inconsistent. Let me show you an example from his own video. This is who I'm debunking and rebuking.
The Romans
today.
defeated the.
Let me show you what he says right here. Listen to what he says at this part. I want you to hear this part, what he says right here.
Roman. So there was Romans that was burning Christians. So Christianity wasn't just a Roman thing; it just became a Roman thing. We're gonna.
All right. So did you hear what he just said? Now the reason why this is important is because he just said that Christianity wasn't originally a Roman thing; it became a Roman thing. But then he goes and backtracks and says that Christianity had to completely be made up. Christianity had to be completely be made up. He just verified that there's evidence by the fire by Nero when Vespasian was under Nero, because Vespasian was under Nero. Emperor Nero was reigning over Jerusalem. And what did Nero do? Do you know there's a historical document in the first century that verifies to us what Nero did? And the detail behind what he did is so important. Is because if you know what he did, that's why he said what he said. Because if you know what he did, you know that Christians were there. You know without a doubt that Christians were there. Because what Nero did, this is what's important. What Nero did was that Nero himself, right? Let me actually go to a video here and play something. He blamed the Christians. Now, what's important about that, for them to make any conspiracy, for them to make a conspiracy saying that the people was going to make Christianity, right? The Christians couldn't been there for Nero to blame. Since Nero blamed the Christians, is already establishing that there were Christians there already. That someone couldn't just make up something that's already there and established. You see what I'm saying? That's just a solid fact of truth. But let me show you something. Okay, I'm gonna show you something right here. So let me just let you hear this recording. Here's a little history behind what happened to Nero. Now, if you've seen his video, the person tried to claim that Nero was killed by someone else. What's interesting about that, by the first century, it was already known that Nero committed suicide, right? It's well known that Nero had committed suicide. We can show multiple documents, even his first century report that talks about Nero's suicide, right? That's very important. When I say important, let me just open this and just talk a little about it. So it's one of those things that it's talked about by many people, when they talk about the early writings from this individual and what he did. Let me actually make it a little more smoother. I'll play this full report. Let's talk about the full report. I'll show you this. Because Tacticus records it. Other people record it. Tacticus records that he kills a bunch of Christians. Tacticus records early that Nero killed Christians, and it's talked about that Nero killed himself. This is important.
Virtually every significant historian blames the fire on Nero himself, no doubt because of what Nero decided to do afterward. He immediately commandeered huge portions of Rome's scorched earth to erect one of the biggest, most opulent palaces in all the known world. It's known as the Domus Aurea, or the Golden House. Nero was also shrewd enough to accuse a scapegoat for the fire to appease the general Roman public. The culprits of choice, the Christians, and blaming them sparked the first great outbreak of state-sponsored persecution that lasted for several years. The Christians were already somewhat of a nuisance, accused of cannibalism because they consumed the Lord's Supper, which commemorated the sacrificial body and blood of Jesus, and atheism because they refused to bow to the Roman gods, including the Caesar. So
Did you know that? Did you know the Romans were calling the Christians atheists because the Romans had their own belief system, and that they were calling the Christians atheists, and that Nero blamed the Christians because a lot of people already didn't really like them, so a lot of people believed it, and they end up committing all types of atrocities to them, and then end up Nero, after a long secession, end up killing himself because of some crazy thing he did, and is recorded by early first century historians. That's very important. And remember, he was talking about Christians, and we're talking. This is before Titus even supposedly meets Josephus, who supposedly in the idea of the reading of those letters. In fact, let me show you who those letters are coming from. Let me actually show you. Let me show you something. Let me show you something. Let me see if I can find it real fast. I want to show you who's writing those letters and basically saying, what he feels like. Let me actually go to it. Let me go to what I think about how it's worded. I'll find it right here. I'll go right to the book. Let me just go right to the book, and I'm gonna talk about these little books and what the writers of these books, because all these books are new books. These are not ancient sources. These are new sources. And they're garbage. Is when I say garbage. Let me just show you what the individual says himself, because there's someone who does an interview with one of the persons who wrote one of the books, and I want to show you his little interview. Um, that he has with him, because I think the interview is important to know what the individual says about his own books, and about what he feels about what he has. You can hear it when I go to it. I'm gonna show you when I go to it. Let me just make sure it was down here, because we're gonna talk about some real history and some real sources. Because the idea of even to go with that conspiracy, you have to completely ignore the historicity before that event, which is no one's going to do that. No one's going to believe a conspiracy when the whole history contests to itself, right? And the whole twisting of these characters is absolutely ridiculous. It's just ridiculous to even fathom, because it's obviously ridiculous when you look at the whole history. The whole picture is going to tell you. Let me see. I'm trying to think about where is this. In fact, I got to think about the name of that book. That's why when I go over this, we're going to talk about it piece by piece. Let me just make sure I grab that one, because there's just so many different pieces. Let me just make sure. So many different pieces that was just all types of mess. All types of what's the word I'm looking for? I can't even think of the words. It's one of those things that it has to be rebuked immediately, because it is absolutely ridiculous. It was one of the most gymnastic twisting of. Now he been saying that the America was the place for a long time. He been saying that America was the place. I was leaving that alone, but this one's just one of those things that it has to be rebuked. It just has to be rebuked. Let me just see. In fact, let me just keep going, because I think it's somewhere down here. I must have went right by it. All right. This one's something else. I'm gonna talk about that too, but that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for this talk that he has. I want to talk about this talk that he has in his book. Let me just go to it, because we're gonna talk about this in pieces. When we talk about this in pieces, and we're gonna talk about this thing. But let me just find where this spot is, if I can find it. Yeah, right here. All right, so let me go to this spot. So this is a book, Creating Christianity. He not all these books is books that he talks about in here. You can see this little book right here, Creating Christianity. Well, a weapon of ancient Rome, as if it was like, oh, well, ancient, fine. This modern book, let me just show you what this person says in this little thing.
You're looking at Piso.
I just want you to
Arius,
hear it.
Calpurnius,
Now, here
Piso.
I want you to listen carefully. Tell me you don't hear a bunch of me's and I's and how I feel and what I think about Christianity and this and that. This is an individual he's in his feelings. He don't have if you really look at he's quoting this guy's book like these are historical sources. These are not historical sources. In fact, there's multiple I'm going to show you multiple pieces of information like the one I was just showing that just debunks it with the most it's the most silliest it's the most silliest doctrine I've ever seen. But let's hear what he says right here. I want you to hear this.
And if anybody reads the book, then you can get a lot more details on this. But we're going to talk about a fair amount here. But if you look at Piso and you look at what his motivations might have been for doing what he did, then it casts a very dark shadow.
Yeah.
And that's something that for somebody who grew up in that environment is disturbing, right?
Yeah.
It's disturbing to think, oh, that's what I was a part of.
Yeah.
Because for me, it was over a period of time, an unshakable feeling that I didn't have the data. I didn't have anything like your book to say, oh, this is what's really going on. All I had was my feeling.
Yeah.
And the evidence of my own life kind of, it was kind of like, okay, where's all this awesome, Christian stuff that I'm supposed to be getting? You know what I mean? The love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, faithfulness, all those sort of good things, right? And it's not that those are bad things, but it was like a magic wand that I kept on trying to, use, and it just wasn't working the way that I wanted it to. And
you
so
weren't getting anything back from it, from the way you felt.
Not, on a very realistic physical level is kind of if like it and also in say competing in the world, there might be some advantages to being a part of a religion, but there's also some, I would say, intellectual disadvantages because there's a constant, say, psychological. What you do is you pull back the veil and you reveal the wizard behind the reasons, the whys, like
from past historians, and then taking what they've written and what they've said about bogus names and just making sure that what they say about the changes in letters and the rules of the different languages to create new names, just making sure that that is accurate, that we have evidence of that taking place. And when you have evidence of that taking place, then you know that, okay, there's no reason they could not do it for this. So then you kind of push on and say, okay, so this guy, his father is known as this guy, but this historian.
All right, so the reason why I wanted to show that real fast is because this is a person today. The book that he's quoting, he's reading his whole book. He's sitting there reading it, right? He's reading it like as if that book that he's reading, this book right here, as if this book is an ancient book. He sits there, read this whole little part, and then he jumps to another one. And then that's why I was showing you that little picture of America. You can see right there. He starts talking about, this is America, this is the homeland. He'll say that this is the homeland, right? And what's interesting is this is that video. This is that picture that he's talking about, that little video, and this is the little thing. If you ever see it, it's ridiculous. He'll tell you that the place had Canaanites there. He said the place had Canaanite there. He'll talk about how it had basically Baal there at the center of the place. Baal. He'll tell you that Baal was there at that place. And he'll talk about, well, that's the place. Like he'll talk about gods, but he'll misread it. He'll say God, but it says gods with an S, like idols. It be certain things like that. It's small pieces that causes that confusion to try to keep that land as being the promised land when it's not. Is multiple pieces that will just shake that out of the water. Besides the fact, in the Bible, the Old Testament, I don't know. I think he tried to bash the Old Testament by the Septuagint, which is a problem in itself because we know the Septuagint is a translation by the Greeks about 300 BC, and the writings of the first Old Testament were spreading throughout the Greek Empire, throughout different empires, the Persian Empire, obviously in Egypt and different areas like that, and obviously Levant. That's the Old Testament. Everyone knew the Old Testament. There's no doubt about the Old Testament. But what's interesting about the Old Testament is that the Old Testament contests that when the people left the land, their promised land, they went to Babylon, right? They settled in Babylon. Babylon was an empire that was well known in history. Well known in history. There's no doubt about Babylonian existence. The Babylonian existence is also contested by its destruction by Cyrus. When Cyrus came there, he made the Cyrus cylinder. The Cyrus cylinder, you can look it up anytime. The Cyrus cylinder contests to its location. He ended up telling the Jews to go settle back in Jerusalem. They go back to the place that was destroyed in Jerusalem, right at the land of Levant. We know this because throughout the land of the Herodians, throughout the time of Antiochus, and throughout the time of the Romans, they're all under Levant. So when it's one of those things that it's just an imagination to try to script the idea that the promised land was in America. It's just an imagination. It's all types of things like that. And this is what I'm going to do. There's a lot of people out there confessing to be wise and show themselves to be fools. And I'm going to be debunking them. I'm going to be looking at a lot of this stuff and I'm going to be debunking. That's what I'm going to do now. Because this is what I'm seeing going on in a lot of places, that a lot of individuals are high-minded, thinking that they have all the wisdom, yet they'll take a conspiracy and treat it like it's a truth. The problem with the conspiracy, because this, like I said, the America thing was one thing, but the problem with the conspiracy is that now he's attacking Christ. Now he's trying to get people not to believe in the Messiah. Now he becomes the enemy. Now the individuals that do that, they're luring people in to the truth. Then they're bringing out their lies until they become hateful. Therefore, they're going to be cut off in the season. So truth has to be brought out. It has to be brought out. It has to. There's no doubt about it. But the reason why I show that, because he himself said, right? He himself said that Christianity exists before, but the Romans end up taking it. We understand that. We understand that later on, especially during the time of Germanics, they started to really take on Christianity, try to alter it. But that happens throughout all the time. Like we see with the Gnostics, they try to change the gospel, but you can't change what is foundation, right? What was already founded, right? What happened? The Neros blamed the Christians. The Christians were already there. How are they going to make up something that was already there? That makes no sense. And the connection, we're going to talk about different connections that are easily breakable. Josephus is not Tacticus, and the individual that he tried to was Pisces, or how you say his name, the individual that he tries to connect. We're going to talk about the book that he uses, and we're going to talk about a little more deeper into the information of what's going on there, because it's quite clear what's going on. But we're going to go through it piece by piece because it's not a long note, but I want to get detailed about each piece. But I just want to do a summary of all these things today. But I want that I'm gonna try to reach that individual, because I'm constantly on his page, putting stuff on his page. I want him to come and debunk me, show me that his document, because all he does is talk. Individuals that all they do is talk and don't want to have no one else controvert with them or have a conversation with them or examine them. That's the type of individuals you got to be careful of. People who just want to talk and collect money. There's a lot of people that just want to talk and collect money, seem like they're wise, seem like they got something better than you. Let's see him come and have a conversation. I want him to prove to me that controversy is a true controversy. Because understand, I've seen all his sources. I've seen the evidence. I've seen what he has. It's not even close. It's already been errorist. He already had multiple lies. But I've been leaving it alone. But now it's time for war. It's one of those things that if this type of information is gonna, because this is one of those things that when I see stuff like this start to increase, it has to be rebuked at the door. It's one of those things that has to be rebuked at the door. Not only, in fact, let's talk about a situation that is, it just gives the story no sense of credibility, and it has to do with what Josephus even writes. If Josephus is the Roman emperors and all those different ones in connection to others, why would he write? Why would he write that right? Why would he write? Therefore, knowing all this, understand. Let's understand, right? Why would Josephus write that Herod, a Edomite, subject to Rome, right, part of the Roman Empire, killed a bunch of Jews? Why would he write? Why would they write that a bunch of Jews, if they wanted to convince the Jews? Why would they write such a heavy detailed story of Herod killing a bunch of children, right? And then all of a sudden saying that the Jews, the same ones who were killed by Herod in the same story, killed the Messiah, and want the Messiah and want the Jews to believe that they not only was killed by Herod, but they also killed the Messiah himself. Now believe our story. Why in the world would the Romans make a story that in itself shows itself to be historically verifiable? And not just historically verifiable. The thing about history is not something that usually is not pretty, right? History is not a fantasy story. It doesn't sound like a fantasy story. It sounds ugly sometimes, right? In fact, a lot of times history is ugly and it's seemingly undesirable. That's what makes the story of the gospel different, because these individuals believe in a story that seems so controversial, yet they're willing to die for its truth, for the truth of it. Not to alter the story, but to stand in the truth of it, even to be tormented by Nero. Though being even set up as Christians, they don't deny their faith. They don't deny the story, because you still got eyewitnesses at that time that's still standing there at that time. But understand the story of Herod massacring Jews, and then the Jews massacring their own Messiah, and then saying that's a made up story, and that's how we're going to get the Jews or even the Christians to believe that story. There's no way the Romans would write such a story that would be so hard to sell. Go see a Christian evangelize. The Romans would have to evangelize that story. They would call them Christoromians or something like that. If the Romans tried to spread such a story, it wouldn't spread the way that people think it would spread. A lot of times they had this fantasy like, oh, they just come up with an idea, they introduce it to the crowd, and everyone accepts it. That's not how it worked in Roman times, nor that's how it worked in any time. Rather, you would have to have a group of individuals that felt so motivated to their story that they were willing to die for the very tale of it, to tell exactly in multiple different places, India, Africa, all the way to Europe. I can even show you they got to France. They went all the way to Spain. The Christians, first century, and we can note that all these things, all their stories are aligned. All their stories are aligned early, and you get the first, and then you get the second century disciples talking about the first century disciples. They'll talk about Mark, Luke, John. They'll talk about different individuals that they were disciples of those individuals. I can show you writings where they talk about Revelation, defending Revelation right after it was written. We could talk about all those things because when we look at when these things were written and how they were written, right? There's a timeline. What's important is anyone who studies the biblical writings, right? The canonization, the writings, the actual paperwork and stuff like that, they actually know it's not like how it is today, right? We know it's not just a book. We know that things weren't written like a book, right? They were written in scrolls, right? And parchment and things like that, right? They weren't just written in a book and said, "Well, there you go. Here's all the gospels and everything. It's everything that we need." But no, they were written in a book in different time frames. I went to 3 different places that basically do like scholarly research and bring out different paperwork to see when certain things were written. Because how do we know when certain things are written? By the setting. That's what's important. Setting, what it talks about in the setting. Um, does other church fathers talk about it? Is it addressed? Is it talked about by others in that area? Right. That's very important when talking about these things. The places of travel and different information that's talked about here. I'll talk about those things when we go over that. And also earthquake reports. Like one time he says, Messiah at his crucifixion, that was earthquakes, right? What's important is, is earthquake reports recorded at Messiah's crucifixion? Yes. It's important to understand. We'll talk about some of these things that if you look at the basically even right now, right, the government reports of earthquakes, you'll note that the earthquake reports align up, right? That was an earthquake exactly at the time of Messiah's crucifixion, right? Just like the Gospels say. We can note that in right in the earthquake reports, right? In fact, I'm gonna go to that real fast. Let's go. Let me look at that real fast on here. Because when going over these things, we have to have evidence, right? So what's important is the 70 weeks prophecy in the book of Daniel actually prophesies of the exact time when Messiah comes, which is contested by the writings of Luke that perfectly aligns with the time that certain emperors reigned at that time, like certain emperors, right? Augustus, Tiberius, to switch over to different ones and whatnot. But let me show you something real fast. Not Tiberius, Claudius. But let me show you something real fast. Here's something from a government site, right? Just recording earthquakes and everything. This little page, I don't know, but this the little site right here. You can see environmental center, whatnot. Just talk about basically recordings of things that happen naturally, like earthquakes. Now, I want you to see this, what they say on their site. This is what they say right on their site. They'll talk about basically that was an earthquake in about is actually estimated between 30 to 33 AD. And they'll tell you that it happened exactly at Israel, Palestine, right? The area where Messiah was. In fact, they on their own site, they would say that 33 AD, Jerusalem, this earthquake, which is said to have occurred during the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ in Jerusalem, caused darkness over all the land, tombs to open, and the ground to split open, right? Now, just for understanding, when you think about 70 weeks prophecy and exact calculations, which we'll talk about too, he actually was baptized in 31 AD. But just to understand, when you think about earthquakes and everything, it's important to know that earthquakes are not pinpoint, right? You can get estimates for it. Like, for example, here, they'll say 30 to 33 AD, right? All showing dates in the list are obviously AD, just talk about this thing. And just says an earthquake identified in basically where you see the Dead Sea, right? By the Roman source reported by the Gospels to have taken place during the crucifixion of Jesus. See what's going on there? Shua Mashiach, right? Very important. That's very important. This is a real report. That's what you're seeing here. This right here. I don't know why it's not right there, but this is a report that I screenshot. That's why I always screenshot this stuff. This is a report I screenshot, right? That's a hunt. Look how many look how far it is from any other time. Look at that gap there, right? That's like a gap of 300 years, right? Right in the midst, right? Right here is 100 years later from the last earthquake. And then 100 years later, exactly when the crucifixion happened. It was quiet, no earthquakes for a while, and boom, Messiah crucifixion, that was an earthquake. It was so strong that it would have made darkness come on it. It said that it was such a strong earthquake, it would have made the area become like darkness. Smoke, remember it said that? It said at the time of Messiah's crucifixion, some of the sky became darkness, right? Could have been multiple earthquakes. Could have been one earthquake, right? Very important. But there was definitely an earthquake recorded at that time. Israel, Palestine, right? Is there a historical recording of Messiah's said earthquake? Yes. Yes, there is. There's a said recording. And that's the thing about recordings. It can be recorded by the earth itself, which all things on the earth belong to Yah. And he has things that do different purposes. Some can record it in different ways, right? And that's your earliest recording of the gospel, of a testimony to the gospel, right? 30 AD, right? Just like the gospel saying, that's the time frame when Messiah was there, right? Messiah was on the cross and it was an earthquake, right in the land of Israel. And we see it right there, contested, right like the gospel say, right? That's just a small piece. All these things I'm showing is just summaries. I'm just showing little small pieces and things like that. Now back to this timeline. The reason why, because I work this week, but I'm gonna be off next week, and I'm gonna go deep into these things, and I'm gonna try to reach this individual. And I want you to see that this man is not as wise as people think he is. That this was happening a lot. It's good that brothers are finding sources and truth, and it's true that Israel is just different people, but they're not. A lot of times you see individuals do extreme bending, right? They're not the Indians, right? They're not the Indians. I'm sorry, it's a truth. They're just not the Indians. And in fact, the Indians genetically, right? A lot of them are Indo-European, are European. The Q group, the R groups, right? Different groups like that crossed over. They got the same genetics. They connect right back to the roots of Adam, right? They're not new people, and they're not different people, right? That's just important. But different writings, I can show you the history that different writings come at different times, right? Different writings come at different times. That's what makes it important. That the writings coming at different times, those different scrolls, it's very important because they will contest themselves even by their own disciples, their later disciples. There's multiple people within these groups that send out multiple letters in different areas. Let me just close some of these things. So close some of these things real fast. So this is something, I don't know if I showed this already, but you can see right here what's gonna say.
Of Arabia too. As early as the 1st century AD, Arab traders brought Christianity to Arabia. Others were evangelized by Paul's ministry in Arabia and by St. Thomas, followed by a strong influence from the Byzantine Empire. For example, the Ghassanids, a vassal kingdom of Rome, converted to Christianity. In the south of the country, a strong Christian community emerged in Najran as a result of the influence of the Ethiopian Christian kingdom of Aksum. Nestorian Christianity was strong in parts of the country, but the most popular denomination was monophysitism. Judaism was also a significant part of the religious landscape of Arabia.
So it's one of those things that's important, right? It's very important to know these things. So I'm gonna see what you're saying, Shalom family. I'm hoping I can reach that man so I can tell him himself of his own errors so he can not fool our people. As the people of Christ are the people of God. No, go ahead. Well, yeah, it's just enough. Yep, that's right. Isn't that something? And that's why we got to look at these things carefully, because this type of doctrine, now, is one thing we find in deep sources on deep things, but once we start leading people away from Christ, then we're messing up. If we're leading people away from the promised land, that's one thing. But if we start leading people away from Christ, that's another thing, right? His PBS is talking about some of the historicity, and a lot of these things. What's important about the historicity of Christ, when I go over these things, you're gonna see that I'm talking. Atheist historians will say the historicity of Christ is undebated. It's undebated. The historicity of Christ. It's just undebated. There's no debating the historicity of Christ. There's no debating it. It's one of those things that's it's just solid. But they talk about it, right? They talk about what happened in the land and whatnot. What's important is, when it starts talking about some of the details that happens there, just to get an understanding of the movements of time, right? Because a lot of times you'll see different things said, but if you note a certain time frame, like the time of Nero, it's one of those times that it verifies to you before Jerusalem fell, there were Christians in massive places, right? We're gonna go over this thing detailedly in certain things, right? We can talk about martyrs throughout different times. Different things that happen, right? Very important individuals. Remember, we talked about this individual. We talk about this individual a lot because he was talking about how he was fighting against basically, how you say, Gnostics, but he was martyred. He was martyred. That's important. That he, right, was in the area in the bishop of Antioch, was martyred, right? That's very important because he himself was actually in the land of the Greeks, right? But a lot of his messages and a lot of his writings have went all the way down to the lands of Egypt, and that's what he was talking about when he was talking about Egypt and around those areas, between Greece and Egypt, right? They would talk about keeping the gospel pure. That's first century. That's early first century. He's already defending something that's early on before him, right? He's talking about something that's before him. And we already know that Nero already addressed that there were Christians there. And now this Christian who was martyred, killed, right? Now let's understand this. Why would Rome illustrate something and then have themselves being killed while they're illustrating their own thing? That's very important. That is one of the most silliest conspiracies that I ever seen in a long time. It's just gonna cause all type of confusion. The whole thing is mental retardation. Josephus is not they're not the same people. The characters that he's trying to blend together, it doesn't work at all. It's the most crazy mashup imagination. The person who made the conspiracy, I'm gonna go over it on what he talks about. These are modern sources, modern people. A lot of them are just speaking on their own emotion, and a lot of their information has been debunked. A lot of it has been debunked already. That's what we're gonna talk about. In fact, all of it. There's nothing that they say. There's nothing that he brought out that is new. It was just bringing back this old conspiracy that's been debunked multiple times. But I think it's important that we thoroughly understand the history of the biblical narrative. We got to understand that history. Obviously, I'm pretty sure many people know where Jerusalem is, unless they get that type of deception, where he's illustrating what he's illustrating there. So that's very important. So we'll talk about this thing throughout the week. We're just going to talk about some of the earliest sources of Christianity and things like that. Again, understanding of those things. So Monday, we're going to go over this and talk about this thing. And it's just going to talk about basically, what's the word I'm looking for? Just understanding some of the first century sources and what's said of these different individuals, and how we can get understanding on these individuals and whatnot. So with that, I guess that's all I got for now. But I will show one more thing real fast. I want to show this last thing that I have over here. I'm gonna go down and grab something, and we're gonna talk about this thing in a lot of detail, because I think it's important to understand. I think it's important to understand the foundation of Christianity. It's exploded, right? The great thing about Christianity, it wasn't just a small camp thing, right? It exploded. Christ, when he said that he was a wheat that died and like wheat dies and increase, he increased, right? It increased to a lot of different people very quickly. A lot of people had got the message. It spread, right? Because it was all with power and things like that. But I'm going to go to this real fast. We're going to talk about, ancient church fathers, like early. Why is it important with church fathers? When I say church fathers, first Christians, right? Early Christians, early believers, some of the first believers, the ones who believed first, right? The ones who start getting the gospel early on. Because they're in, a lot of them are going to be in different areas, right? Witnessing to a lot of these things and whatnot, witnessing to the truth, right? Different centuries, first century, second century. The reason why a lot of this is important is because different messages in different places are going to contest to what is there, right? So we're going to talk about a couple of different church fathers, right? Clement, right? Very early, right? You can see a lot of different individuals that are going to be very early. And why is that important? Because if the Romans are the first ones to have it, they have to evangelize, right? Could you imagine them trying to evangelize such a message? So it'd be harder for them to convince a people of such a story than for the story to be real itself. The story to be real would make more sense than them to convince this many people of their story. It would not work. Look, think about all the religions that ever exist, right? All the idols that ever exist just don't stand, right? In fact, that's what we'll talk about too, because he also tries to. A lot of people do this. They see these videos that talk about, oh, Christ is identical to all these idols and stuff like that. But a lot of people don't even know the history behind those idols. So they bend the information to try to make it fit like they all have the same characteristics. Like, for example, let me show you something. There's an individual.
For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. If you would like to support the channel and become part of our ancient history fan community, visit patreon.com/World of Antiquity. Do you remember that film, the Zeitgeist movie that came out a number of years ago and caused a bit of a stir? Well, there's an ancient history portion of the film, which I began reviewing in a previous video, by the way. If you haven't seen it and you want to go check it out, I'll leave a link for you below. In that one, I talked about the claims made by the film's writer, Peter Joseph, about the Egyptian god Horus. It turns out he didn't know his history all that well, but that's because he got his information from some faulty sources. This time, we're going to look at his claims about other ancient gods, Attis, Krishna, Dionysus, and Mithras. And I'll share with you some correspondence I had with Peter Joseph about the movie back in 2007. I saved the emails. Let's just say we didn't see eye to eye. It refers to the obsession with finding parallels in two pieces of literature and then making more out of the parallels than is justified. This is not something unique to pseudo-history or fringe research. Scholars themselves have fallen prey to it. In the 20th century in particular, it became very popular to find parallels in literary works and then take them a little too far. Don't get me wrong, comparisons of this sort have proven very valuable in helping us to understand literature better. Literary parallels exist, and literary influence exists. Sources do copy other sources. We call it parallelomania only when more is made of the parallels than is actually there. For example, when the similarities are trivial or have to be taken out of context in order to be able to work. Where we left off last time.
For many other gods are found to have the same general mythological structure. Attis of Phrygia, born of the Virgin Nana on December 25th, crucified, placed in a tomb, and after 3 days was resurrected.
So I'm showing this little thing. I'm sure a couple different people seen this. I'm sure a couple different people seen this video. I'm sure a couple different people seen this video before. So I'm playing this, and other people probably heard of this video before, but I'm gonna show it.
Is this true? In the myth of Attis, was he born of a virgin on December 25th, crucified, placed in a tomb, and resurrected after 3 days? No. In my email exchange with Peter Joseph, the film's creator, here's what I wrote. Regarding Attis, the daughter of the god of the Sangarius River, conceived Attis not by sexual intercourse, but by taking the fruit of an almond tree that had grown up from the sexual organ of Agdistis, which the gods had cut off. But as you can see, a penis was still involved, as in the case of Isis. Perhaps it would be best to change the wording on all of these from born of a virgin to born without sexual intercourse, or something like that. Attis was not crucified, and there's no myth of which I'm aware that says he was buried for 3 days. Peter Joseph wrote me back, saying, Attis was conceived by immaculate conception, which is mythologically synonymous with virgin birth. Well, immaculate conception is not mythologically synonymous with virgin birth. First of all, immaculate conception refers to being born without sin. But if Peter means simply being born without sex, it's still not the same as virgin birth, mythologically or otherwise. Because in myth, a woman who is not a virgin is capable of having a child without sex. The story involving the conception of Attis, which I referred to, comes from the writer Arnobius from the 3rd century CE. How old that story is and whether it originated before the Jesus story, we don't know. But if the almond that impregnated Nana grew from a penis, her eating it is pretty much just a fanciful way of having sex. He continues, Attis castrated himself and laid against a tree in cruciform. The myth very clearly says that Attis castrated himself. But this is not a crucifixion. None of the versions of the myth say he was crucified. Peter's backtracking from what he said in the movie, and now says Attis laid against a tree in cruciform. That's a stretch. No pun intended. Peter is claiming that Attis leaned on a tree in a pose resembling crucifixion. I could find none of that in any of the versions of the Attis myth. It describes how he is killed, and in most versions by a wild boar. in others by a stray spear during a boar hunt. Nothing resembling a crucifixion. In fact, there's no mention of his resurrection in the extant versions of the myth either. There is mention of a pine tree. In one version, after he castrates himself, he lays down under a pine tree and dies there. Under the tree, not on it. In other versions, he turns into a pine tree. Peter continues, "Now, the question comes down to what is more important, the tradition or the myth, in certain circumstances." So what he means here is that maybe the myth is not as important as the tradition. And by tradition, he refers to the religious rites performed in honor of Attis. He says, "The Passion of Attis, played out every year," in Roman something, in the 1st century, pinned an effigy of Attis to a tree in cruciform at the vernal equinox. It was in practice. They then placed him in a cave for 3 days and then brought him out as resurrected. What he says here is basically correct. In Roman times, there was a festival to Attis every year in the spring, and this festival was based on the myth of Attis. And during it, they celebrated Attis's resurrection from the dead. So although we don't have reference to his resurrection in the surviving versions of the myths, we have it commemorated in the festival. So clearly a popular version of the myth had the resurrection. But here's the thing. The versions of the myth that we have are from a time earlier than the festival was instituted. The resurrection of Attis appears to be a late innovation to his story. Scholars think it became part of the Attis myth in the 2nd century CE, which is after the first Christian Gospels were written. As for the timing of the festival, it was celebrated in March. The Day of Blood, as it was called, observed on March 24th, with an effigy of Attis placed in a tomb, and the rejoicing on March 25th, 1 day later, when Attis's resurrection was celebrated. So not 3 days, but 1 day. He continues, "What it comes down to is that this is the same for Jesus. Jesus was paganized just like Attis. The traditions were the same. For example, nowhere in the Bible does it say Jesus was born on December 25th, yet that is the way it is celebrated." I'm in total agreement with that. Jesus was paganized over the centuries. Nothing new or groundbreaking about that. But is that really all the movie's trying to show? No. It's trying to argue that the story of crucifixion and resurrection after 3 days, as described in the Gospels, was borrowed whole cloth from pagan myth. Well, show us a pagan myth from before the time of the Gospels, then, that tells that story.
So I want to show something real fast. Now, what's important is a lot of when you see sources that may talk about seemingly the same thing, you got to note the dates. Let me show you something concerning the belief of Christianity and Messiah's birth. The first disciples, right, did not keep his birth the way that other people may think that he kept his birth. That's very important. Let me just show. Matter of fact, let me see if I find this real fast on this thing right here. Let me just show you something. Because whenever people think about, yes, Christmas is extremely pagan and it's not even Messiah's birth. It's very important. If you look very closely on the time of Christmas, right, the information of Christmas, you'll understand that Christmas, right, was something that came later on. But the early disciples didn't do that. I'm gonna read you something. Christian writers, right? Remember that one we was just talking about a little earlier? We talked about a writer, and here's another one. We're gonna talk about these two writers, right? These are gonna be some first century writers. They say nothing about the festival, right? They say nothing about any festival of Christ's birth, right? That's very important. Even other first century writers even mocks Roman celebrations of birth anniversaries, right? Certain ones in the first century, they mock the Romans. They mock the Romans for their birth celebrations and their anniversaries, right? It's later when that stuff start happening, when the Germanics start picking the stuff up. When the Germanics start taking, like, for example, when the Catholic, that's two words to Catholic. I mean, that's two definitions to Catholic. Well, two definitions. Time frame matters when you think of the word Catholic, right? That's the little Catholic with a little c, and it's Catholic with a big C, right? Catholic with a little c means universal, right? Catholic with a big C came later when the Roman Catholics start coming and start making their way the way they wanted to and start basically Germanizing a lot of stuff, right? But the gospel still exists. It's always like that. You're always going to have someone that doesn't keep the way right. That doesn't mean that the way is lost. That just means that someone's not keeping the way right, right? So individuals obviously mocking that practice, right? This is a pretty good indication that Christmas was not obviously anything that was celebrated at that time, right? We can talk about other individuals, right, and different ones that speak, right? By late second century, there was considerable interest in dating the birth of Jesus, right? Obviously, when they talk about different things, when they talk about the birth of Jesus, none of them pointed to December 25th, pretty much. Well, just to make it plain and simple, that we could talk about that, and we could talk about different things with that, and we can go into the information, where did Christmas come from, the origins of it, and whatnot. The first century Christians, in fact, I'm gonna read you something from what one of the Christians had said. Let me see if I can find it. All right, so watch what this writer said here. Let me read something right here. So nor is it included it's obviously going to be a read from this, who writing in the last year on the second century, he's going to just talk about something, right? Talk about not to this is a basically a first second century writer, right? I don't know if I say his name right, Tertullian. He's actually writing saying Christians not to partake in what is called Saturnalia. Saturnalia, right? You know what Saturnalia is like? You can relate it to basically, what they think like Christmas and stuff, right? They'll talk about these different things and whatnot. Let me show you something. What he says. It's really interesting. It's a quote. I'm going to read you a quote, what he says and whatnot, when he talks about these birthdays and whatnot. Watch what it says. Saturnalia, or how you say that, Saturnalia, and New Year's and midwinter festivals are frequent, right? President Gold, these are things that happen. Matter of fact, let me just read the quote. Let me read the exact quote. I'm gonna read you the exact quote. Let me go to here. Let me think about where it's at. This was not even it. I'm gonna see where it's at. I want to read you the exact quote. I probably screenshot it. So I'm gonna see if I got a screenshot. It's an interesting little screenshot. Let me see. Not this one. This one's just another one on a different topic. This one's interesting though. But let me read you this quote. I want to find you this one quote that's just like a direct one on it that I want to see if I cap it. Let me see if I cap it. That's why I always usually keep sources. Let me just see. This one's just a random one. I just thought about real fast. I just wanted to see it on here. Yeah, it is. It is this one. Let's see. Yeah, it's this one. Right here. Just as the heathens does not celebrate the Lord's Day, they'll say Saturday, Sunday, but they just say the Lord's Day, or Pentecost. So Christians should not partake in their festivals. Rather, they have a festival every week, whereas pagans celebrate only once a year, right? Right, and think about it. Pagans, he's talking about pagans celebrating once a year. It's just talk about the Saturnalia, that time frame that comes up, right? It seems like Christmas, but it's actually a pagan thing that the first saints, the early saints, were saying not to have anything to do with it. They're saying don't have anything to do with it, right? So it's one of those things that we can get the information and talk about these things and whatnot, that the early Christians weren't doing Christmas and stuff like that. It's all types of different information that shows they were not only believers, they were defending the way that you believe. They were defending the type of way that you would actually believe, right? And that's very important. That's actually very important to know that Christmas is a later thing that came, but the early saints, they didn't have nothing to do with it. It's very important. But this little video, if you want, I already had it in the description, but it goes over different. What's the word I'm looking for? If you've seen that video has a bunch of claims. Talk about claims on top of claims on top of claims, saying Christ is like this person, like this person. He completely debunks it because a lot of times is twisting of information. Because a lot of times people get emotional and write these books and try to make their own facts and make it squeeze together like it's actually working. But once you start finding the hole in the idea, you start to find out there's a lie in the midst. There's a lie in the midst. Like, for example, people trying to say Christians began later. We know they came there all the way early on, right? And we'll talk about that. We'll get into these things and whatnot. So But I want you to see some of these things, just some different things that we're going to get into in a little more detail, as it's always good to know truth, and I think knowing the foundation of the faith is quite important. We can even get the example of the seven churches, the original seven churches. We still got the findings of those seven churches. We can see the ruins of them, right? We can see different things, little pieces of information, right? We know the Christians were there because we can get very early sources, first century, second century sources. Because remember, you don't want to just get just the sources. You want to get sources that verify those sources, right? Like first century sources that verify the second century source, or second century sources that verify the first century sources, and different locations, right? Different locations talk about those different things and whatnot. I want to play this little piece, and then I'll leave it like that. I'm just gonna play this little piece, and then we'll move forward. And if anyone got any questions or any ideas or anything like that, or if someone can get in contact with that man, I want to talk to him. I want to talk to that man. I really want to talk to that man, and I want him to correct what he done. I want him to correct what he done, because I think it's very deceitful and very unscholarly if you're supposed to know this much in the books, and you're going to say even the statement, because I showed you in this video, I showed you that he said himself that Christianity, that's because that reading from Nero, from that little part, I don't know if I still have it over here. I had it open, probably closed it because we're flying through these little things. But on that part where he was talking about Nero, right? Nero and Tacticus, or not Tacticus, Vespasian being under Nero, he talks about that they were persecuting the Christians. And he says, see, well Christians, it was taken by these later ones. So it doesn't make any sense to make a conclusion that obviously the Christians were there, seeing that it was recorded by Nero, right? And different individuals. We should be aware of how we need to be careful of conspiracies, right? We can't take every book. Are we going to take every modern book of people that write stuff and say, oh, this is a new book, or this is a deep book, this is a deep find? We're going to connect these things, because we could be building deception. We could be building, and that's what I believe that type of thing is. Now, I don't think in the sense a lot of these individuals are righteous, but when I see people, they say they praise the Most High, and then they start to go backwards like that, you're going to note that that's someone that either needs to be corrected, or they won't listen. They're doing it for the money, and they're stuck in one. But let me show you something. So this is a little video. This little video is really interesting because this is a historian that talks about the existence of Messiah. Talks about events from the 60 AD, 70 AD. But this one, matter of fact, I'm gonna leave this one because this one we have to go into detail, because this is gonna be all for talking about Paul. We talk about Paul and the historicity behind him, like we was talking about in Arabia and things like that. All those things are historically contested. So it's one of those things that, because I seen he'll try to connect Paul and make Paul the same. It's like so many different people trying to mash together, and it just makes no sense. It's one of those things that makes no sense when you start seeing what's going on in these areas. Let me just go to this one right here. Here it is. I just want to read this little area, this little right here, because he said it, right? He said it himself. Try to say that Christianity was already there, right? But obviously, getting a good understanding on these things, we gotta be careful. I'm just gonna play this piece again one more time, just to get last witness.
As you can see,
because this is gonna be my mission now, to get a conversation in on this.
Roman. So there was Romans that was
Let me go
burning
back
Christians.
a little bit.
How do you
All
recommend you
so
guys
watch them talk about this. Remember, this evidence is evidence itself. He's going to talk about Nero and what he was doing to the Christians, and knowing Christians was there before the plot came, before the said plot of Josephus coming together with Vespasian and with the other person, Piso, and coming together and making some crazy confusion. But it doesn't work out. It doesn't work out at all, because what he does is he mistakes Piso and Flavius and think that Josephus' name was always Flavius. But Josephus got the name Flavius from Vespasian, when Vespasian, who was of the Flavius family, gave that to Josephus, which is a different individual. He didn't have, when it says that what's his name, original name was Flavius Josephus. Josephus is a Romanized name of Joseph. Joseph, the name Joseph was not a name that only one person had. Joseph or Josephus was a famous name. Many people had the name Joseph, but he's connecting just because he sees the name Joseph Flavius or Flavius Joseph or Flavius Josephus. He thinks that that's the same person who later gets the name. The source that he shows of the person with the name Joseph or uh, Joseph or Flavius Joseph, right? The source that he shows is an earlier source before Josephus even gets the name. And we know that Josephus is a real person that is later introduced because Tacitus talks of him. Other people talk about him. Different individuals talk about him. He's a person that's there. And we're going to talk about that he got that name later on, and it's contested that the person who is named Joseph Flavius has the name Joseph Flavius early. So why would they end up talking about someone being rewarded the name later on after his prophecies come to pass? It's historically contested that he was released from prison. He was going to be killed while he was fighting in Rome. But we'll talk about those things. We'll talk about these things because it's not just, a lot of times it's this is the idea that you wouldn't know what's before these dates, right? This right here is as early as date 68 AD. There's stuff that happens way before that, way before that, like the stuff that's recorded with the Gnostics and different ones with the church fathers that contest to these things, the spreading of the gospel. Thomas going all the way up through Armenia to India. Obviously, Paul going to Arabia, Mark going down into Africa, and the different Christian sects that's already in different areas, from the lands of the Greeks to the lands of Italy, and to the lands of all the way to Spain, right? While the Romans hated it, right? And had their own belief and their own practices in that time. A lot of times what the Roman emperors really would want, they would actually want someone to, what's the word I'm looking for? They would rather want someone to worship them. That's very important. Why would they lead someone to someone else who in their self says only worship me only and points to the God of the Bible? It's very important that it's saying that this individual, right, who died for us, who's actually witnessing himself by his disciples, is being put as a background character because of someone reading a modern book of a conspiracy that doesn't have enough sources to even support itself. Even in itself shows itself to be false. Even in itself shows itself to be false. Like this paper right here. I just want you to hear what he says right here.
Go back and watch those videos. You know, this was way back 2-3 years ago, but they're still very relevant now with what we're going to learn when we're talking about religions, right? Especially the main ones, Christianity. We in one of them. And the Holy Roman part of it, right? The Roman. So there was Romans that was burning Christians. So Christianity wasn't just a Roman thing. It just became a Roman thing. So Christianity wasn't just a Roman thing. It just became a Roman thing.
So Christianity wasn't a Roman thing. It became a Roman thing. But this first episode, he said that. And then on the next one, he said, no, it was completely made up after by the Flavius Josephus, a made up person who's one with oh man, we're gonna go over it. We're gonna go over this thing because it's one of the most. He's the one. We're gonna go over this thing and talk about it because it's absolutely backwards. It's as backwards as him trying to sell that Jerusalem was in America. That's how far off that message is. That message is so far off that you had to be completely blind to history to believe such a claim. You have to be completely blind to history to believe such a claim. That's how backwater it is. It's so backwater that the idea that the Romans would spread such a thing and evangelize it. Remember, all the saints, what the Christians were doing was evangelizing. Remember that. They were evangelizing, dying for the faith. right? They weren't getting a lot of money. They were getting a lot of tormenting, right? You can look it up when you look at the seven churches of Revelation, right? We got actual like the real churches, right? We got different examples. Like for example, here he goes to the actual fallen churches, all seven of them, by pinpoint location, and all the different church fathers that talk about it, different things that happen at these different areas of these churches, talking with experts about these churches, the different things that happened in the time when these churches were set up. And these are remember, these are the churches that were talked about in Revelation. Revelation was a first century document. These churches and these pinpoint areas were churches that were established in these areas. That's very important. So he's ignoring all the scholarly information that verifies not only is Josephus a credible Jew. When I say a Jew, he's a Judean, right? He's not a Roman, because a Roman doesn't know that much history or in the sense of the details of the internals of the temple. That's the thing about Josephus' writings. He actually gets into details of the internal of the temple. That's important because he was actually a Levite. He had to be a Levite to know that the internal information on what's going on and all the things with the Sanhedrin, which he goes into detail of. And what's also important is we know that he comes later. We know because it's all types of different examples, multiple different examples we can show when we go over this. But these churches, these certain churches, right? This is just one of them. They have multiple pieces of layers of evidence that contest to their time, that contest to what happened there and whatnot. This is a very, very interesting to watch, the seven churches of Revelation, where he goes into the historicity of all seven churches that were spoken of in the book of Revelation before the things came to pass. The churches fell, right? They were persecuted. The people were persecuted. The details of the time is all accurate. That's one of those things that's very important when we look at the things. But we had to talk about this because this is going to be something that's going to it's going to be something we're going to talk about, right? It's going to be one of those things we're going to talk about because I think it's important to know. I think it's very important to know history, and I think it's very important to know the biblical narrative. I think it's deceptive. I think it's quite deceptive what he's doing here. Is one of those things that is easily debunked. That's what we're gonna do. So we're gonna go deep into it. We'll talk about the Council of Nicaea, just like how I showed you. We already had church fathers verify the canon before the Council of Nicaea. That's very important. And I even showed you an early first century church father who was talking about the order of the gospel, who was fighting against the Gnostics, which we also found the writings of the Gnostics, which are first century writings. So the Gnostics were people that were fighting against whom? The Christians that were already there. And the Christians were establishing the ancient writings by the first disciples. From the story, this is the thing about Christianity. The same story in 100 AD that was in Israel is the same story that we find in 42 AD, right? When I say 42 AD, right? When we were talking about the area of Africa, right? Talking 42 AD, the same story, the same exact story, we can find it in Ethiopia. We can find it in Ethiopia. We can find it in the lands of Egypt, right? And we can find it in the lands of India, right? And I'm not talking, like I said, I'm gonna show you something real fast. We're not talking just guesswork. I'm talking sources, right? I'm pulling up people that they got sources contesting to these things themselves when they're talking about these things and going to these things as carefully as they possibly can so that these things can be understood. Because we know there's a lot of deception.
Around Fort St.
Right?
George.
This is one of those things, but I'm gonna show another piece of this little one from India right here, just to get a little more understanding on it.
Some historians dispute about the coming of Thomas to India. We will try to see today about the writings of some of the. This center was opened by Demetrios, the Patriarch of Athens. He was a historian from the first centuries after Christ. First among them is Panthenus. He was a philosopher under the Alexandrian Catechetical Center. This center was opened by Demetrios, the Patriarch of Alexandria, who was reigning as 12th successor in the see of Saint Mark. In fact, soon after he became the Patriarch, he established this catechetical center, which was open for learning about Christianity and Christ. It seems that a few Indians, delegates, went to meet him, asking his assistance to send a few learned people in order to dialogue with the Brahmins in India, also to teach the Indian Christians about the Christianity. Panthenus was selected for his apostolic seal and his knowledge about Christianity. Panthenus reached India in AD 189 and 190. It seems that he saw the Indians are already using the Bible, the Gospel according to Saint Matthew. And he also had discussions with the Brahmins, and with his knowledge he helped the Indian Christians.
So what's important is these Indian Christians, we're going to go into this in detail. The Indian Christians, they didn't have the Gospel of Thomas. They had the Gospel of Mark. That's what those Indians, the Indians in India, right? When we're talking, because we're going to talk about the migration, they're going to talk about basically, giving scholarly information. Talk about the migration to Arabia, through different areas of Armenia, going to India, right? Talk about how Christianity has spread all these areas, not just this little area, and not just in Rome, but in all these areas. It exploded. It exploded. That's why Paul, there's a writing where he says their voice went into the whole world, because a lot of times they thought that was the known world, right? That's little area. They thought. All right, sorry about that. But if anyone has any questions or any statements or anything concerning the subject or any of these subjects, I would definitely take them into consideration. And we're going to bring out this thing with some, I'm talking deep, 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 deep sources, fam. I'm talking deep, just to establish who is who, what is what, who are these names, what's going on. Because a lot of times when people see these names, they see Flavius Josephus, they think there's only one Flavius Josephus. I can go to multiple different pieces of writing and show you multiple names, right? For example, during the time of the Maccabean revolt, there was an Antiochus Epiphanes. How many Antiochus Epiphanes were there? A lot of times, ancient empires or ancient people would have people by their name, by their own name. So you'll have Antiochus Epiphanes the first, the second, the third, Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth, Antiochus, all these different ones with different people, but the same name, right? But you got to be careful what you're looking at when you're looking at those names. And I'm gonna show you that the book that he's quoting, even the person that himself will say that he made mistakes. He'll talk about that he's not really a scholarly individual, and he himself made mistakes. And a lot of them are just copying each other, and they're copying this old book that was debunked. They're copying this old book with this conspiracy, connecting this name by connecting Peso saying, oh well, his pen name was Joseph, was Joseph Flavius or Flavius Joseph, right? And what's the problem with that is that Joseph is a Romanized name of the name. Well, Josephus is Josephus Flavius, right? Joseph or Flavius Josephus, right? The name is a Romanized name, but his first name is Joseph. It gets important, it gets deep when we go over these things and talk about it in detail. I just hear these little munchkins over there. We're going to talk about some important things. I think it's going to be very important to know about some of these things and who is this person? You know, who really is this person? Because really, it's a miss. If you, I'm gonna show you that the person made a mistake, right? Because look at this name. This name is known who he actually is talking about. It's talking about this person. That's what it's talking about. And this person is important when you're looking at this person and what he did. It's known that he was a conspirator, right? Because what he's using is his old conspiracy, but the conspiracy was blown out of water. It's very important. It talks about this individual, right? He was a senator in the first century, right? It just talks about he had a conspiracy, right? He made a conspiracy against Nero, right? He's making a conspiracy. It says the most famous and wide range plot against the throne of Emperor Nero. We're going to talk about that. What happened with this conspiracy? Why did they get blown out of water? A lot of times they end up saying, "Oh, it was." Now you got somebody who brought up this conclusion in the 1900s that said it was. He was saying that he was making the Christianity, stuff like that. Got debunked. It got debunked instantly because of all the different scholarly sources before that event. But here it comes again. A lot of times when the internet world is out, you're going to have a lot of this information getting twisted with modern sources, right? We're going to talk about it. We'll talk about these different things and who he really is and the connection with these things and whatnot and these names. And it'll give a clear understanding on the separation of these different characters and whatnot. But let me get back to this one. I want to end it on this little video because I think this little video summarizes it fairly well. Let me just go to this. So we'll be talking about this thing because I think that type of doctrine is as backwards as trying to say America is the promised land. I think that's how ridiculous it is. But it's that serious. You got individuals that are being tricked in it, that are being fooled, being completely fooled and deceived and duped and losing their faith because of somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. So that's why we're gonna talk about these things and bring some understanding to it. But let me actually type it down here. I think let me just close these things. So I'll end up talking about these things in a minute. Just close this. So as you see, we'll be going over these deep things in a little bit. Just gonna show these things for summary. Let me just go something here real fast. I'm gonna end it on this little this little thing. All right. For the sake of this information, just ending it, summarizing it, and coming back to it. We'll come back to it, but let's end it on this little video just to get a clear understanding. That's nothing new.
Says that
it's nothing new under the sun, and it's been debunked. But let's see.
The Testament was written in a code that requires you to read Josephus's War of the Jews of 473 A.D., when Atwill says that the idea was concocted by the Romans. Quite simply, if Christianity can be demonstrated to exist before that time, this theory is toast. The famous historian Tacitus says that Nero was persecuting Christians in Rome in 64 A.D. He also mentions that immense multitudes of Christians were living in Rome at the time. Try to figure out why immense multitudes of Christians are in Rome 10 years before Christianity was supposed to have been invented. Suetonius also mentions Nero punishing Christians, as well as many Christian historians. This seems like a bad PR idea, to write this kind of stuff. Hey everyone, join the new religion so we can burn you alive and feed you to lions. The sign-up sheet is right over there. Paul, who tradition has being killed by Nero around 66 AD, wrote 13 of the letters in the New Testament, all of them very Christian. Even the most skeptical scholars in this field don't date these letters later than 68 AD, and most of them much earlier than that. Okay, so let's move beyond the historical problems with saying that Christianity didn't exist before 73 AD, and let's look at some of the common sense or logical problems with his theory. Why in the world would the Romans do this? They had already totally crushed the Jews in 70 AD, destroying the city and the temple. When the Romans had a problem with people not wanting to conform to their rules, which they did often, they did what they do best: crush people into submission with war. There was never any reason to do anything different, especially at this point in their history. Also, consider that the Jews weren't even a threat to them in any meaningful way. Precedes it can be found in Acts 5:29 and 4:19. It's difficult to express how atrocious and downright scary that idea would be to the Romans. Their suspicion in the past shall obtain pardon. Think about that logically. Trajan is saying that the proof that a person is really a Christian in his eyes is that they won't worship the emperor. Does that really sound like something that Rome would create for the people? If there was anything that Rome was more scared of than angering the gods, it was slave revolts. 75% of the Roman Empire consisted of slaves, and so if they ever got the idea to rally around a cause, they could easily destroy Rome. So why create a religion where the hero is a falsely accused criminal who was crucified by the Roman government? This mass of slaves being loyal to the Christian God over and above the emperor, as well as being anti-Roman gods, was a very bad thing for Rome. It also gave these slaves a new sense of honor. For example, devoted followers to go convert Roman Aramaic-speaking Jews. Another logical impossibility is that all these Jews just accepted these hot-off-the-presses Gospels, which were claiming to be historical, as true, even though they all just lived through the time period that these Gospels were describing, but obviously no one ever saw any of the events recorded in them because they were all made up. So, this guy was going around raising the dead, healing leprosy, healing the sick. He became a rock star all throughout Israel, where crowds routinely got up to 5,000. He had all these royal rumbles with rulers in public places, turning over tables in the temple, etc. He was even crucified on the Passover when an eclipse and an earthquake happened, and no one ever said, "Hey, I don't remember seeing any of that. I don't know anyone that ever did. My parents never spoke of it. What the heck? I'll die for that." There are a ton of problems with the idea that Josephus wrote all the Gospels, but most of them are kind of technical, so I won't dwell on them here, but I will direct you to my website for more information about why textual critics think such an idea is really silly. Naturally, since Atwill has no real history or science on his side, he spends most of his time on what he calls parallels between the New Testament and Josephus's book, The Wars of the Jews. Atwill states that by comparing these two works, you can crack the code that shows that Jesus was just being compared to the Emperor Titus. One reviewer of Atwill's book, who clearly thinks that Jesus is a myth, so they have no religious reason to disagree with him, said the following of his parallels, quote, "The Jesus story is myth, but Atwill's presentation of, quote, proofs and, quote, discoveries are convoluted. The clues Atwill, quote, discovered are so vague that, like the prophecies of Nostradamus, historical facts have to be reinterpreted and their meanings changed in order to bend and twist events so that they appear to follow a chronology similar to a historical campaign of war against the Jews found in the War of the Jews." So, for example, Atwill says that when in Matthew 4 it says, quote, "Then he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men,' they immediately left their nets and followed him." The parallel to this is supposed to be when Josephus recorded Titus, after a naval defeat of the Jews, killed the ones remaining in the water by spears and cutting off their hands. If you don't see the parallel, it's probably because you aren't smart enough like Atwill is. After all, he is the only one who knows the secret code of the New Testament. Maybe it will help if I explain another so-called parallel. Josephus reports that a woman named Mary ate her child during the siege of Jerusalem when there was no food left. Atwill says that this gruesome act of starvation was supposed to represent Jesus, saying that the bread at the Last Supper represented his body, which would be broken for them. These kind of claims, of course, are unfalsifiable. Whenever you choose to change meanings to your liking, you can make anything be a match. And so this section of his book is pretty much worthless. Nevertheless, I will provide links to further debunkings of his parallels, as well as much information as I can find on the debunking of Atwill's theory on my website, CaesarsMessiahDebunked.com. Thanks for your time.
So it's just talking about Caesar's Messiah. No, that's just one of the sources. I'm going to talk about all of them. He has a lot of bogus sources and sources that connect things in ways. And a lot of times the sources don't even connect. A lot of times they don't even connect. It's just random types of connections that don't make no sense at all. Especially when you start knowing who these individuals are behind these things. And we know about this conspiracy. It's not a hidden. It's not a mysterious conspiracy. It's been conspiracies that have been happening through many different time frames throughout all time. But to bend the conspiracy to fit in such a way just shows the problem with. Now, it's one thing to bring the sources out, but once we start trying to bend the sources to fit some type of narrative, that's when there's a problem. That's when problems usually start happening, because conspiracies don't make sense when there's back history that doesn't attest that that conspiracy is true. Like, for example, the conspiracy supposedly is that the whole act was to develop Christianity, but Christianity was there before. So what would be the point of all the gymnastics? All the gymnastics, all the gymnastics would make no sense. They would they would have to evangelize the gospel. Remember, this isn't like you just send out an email, send out a letter out to some people and say, here, do this thing. You gotta completely convince the people. You gotta convince the people to believe it, to spread it, to die for it, to be willing to die for it, and to repeat it in its perfect harmony. That's the problem with the idea of it being made up, is that they're going through that process for what reason when it's already made. It's already there. It's already something that's there. And he already says it himself that Nero, right, already witnessed himself. Nero already witnessed himself that there were Christians there, right? And we get first century sources that contest to it, that seals the deal to it, right? And that's what we'll talk about. We'll talk about these books, right? That one was one of them, right? That book was what was it? Caesar's Messiah. This one's the creating Christianity. All of them are modern sources. They're all modern sources, and they're wrong. A lot of times when you break these things down, they have wrong information. They have just wrong information themselves and whatnot. I'll just play this little. No, I'll let this alone, because this is stuff I'm gonna break down when the time comes. We're gonna break down all those things and whatnot. All these, and we'll talk about the early writings and how we got first century writings and the spreading of the churches. Right, we'll talk about these things and all those things. But I just want to show a little piece of these things because I think it's very important to get a decent understanding on these things, just to have a good understanding on what's happening. And we'll talk about Claudius and different individuals, and we'll tie these things together. So I guess I'll end it on this summary right here. I'll go down and just go to this summary right here. No, I'll leave this alone. We'll talk about that afterwards. I'll just leave it like this. There's a lot of sources. There's no doubt of how many sources there are that Christianity, the belief of Christ, right? The Son of Messiah that was sent on the promise by the 70 weeks prophecy. The 70 weeks prophecy that prophesied of the Messiah's coming. When he arrived exactly as it was said. With all the paper, everything contesting to it. Everything contesting to the event, the earthquake event. We even got, what's important is we even got the writings from the book of Matthew, because a lot of people don't know this. We got the Arabic writing, not the Arabic, keep getting that word, Aramaic writings of the book of Matthew, because the book of Matthew was actually written in the Aramaic, like you say that word weird, but it's like Hebrew. It's like Hebrew with a different type of it's like a cousin, right? It's like a cousin, like related to Hebrew. But that writing itself is found, right, of the book of Matthew. And it's a really early copy of it. Very, very important to have that writing. And we'll talk about that too when we get to it and talk about these things. And we'll talk about basically, just a clarification. Because remember, like I was saying, we talk about Paul and how we know Paul is rich. We'll talk about different individuals that talk about Paul, right? Clement of Rome and different individuals in different areas, Polycarp and different individuals that talk about Rome. We'll talk about the areas that was happening there, and Paul. Talk about Paul. because I never seen such a twist of information. I just think it's important that we clarify it. So it's one of those things that we're gonna have to clarify it. We'll have to clarify it and talk about it. So let me just make sure. I'm just making sure, summarizing what I want to summarize today. Nothing much, just this, right? It's just a little information. We'll talk about this. Paul in Arabia, going over some different sources and whatnot. We'll talk about those things. But just for clarity, keep the faith. Stay strong. Avoid those who cause offense. If they try to alter any information, just keep the faith. Stay strong. Stay away from anyone that's causing deceits. We're going to break down something that I think is one of the most controversial pieces of evidence I ever seen, and wrong, absolutely wrong. The individual thinks America is the promised land. Now he thinks that the whole fleet of history is all of the same person. So it's gonna be one of those things we'll talk about, break it down, and show what went wrong and how these things get all tied up in a knot. So I don't know if anyone ever dealt with this, but I'm gonna be spreading this news to individuals on that place so I could try to get, because it's some believers that are getting wrapped in that lie. I could tell that they're believers. I could tell they're losing their faith because they think that this person has some information, but really, when you go into the deep information of it, it's deception. It's deception. That's what it is. It's deception, and it's a lie, an incorrect thing that's been traveling throughout time for a long time. It's false. It is not true. So we'll talk about these things when we get the chance. So with that, family, be blessed, be beloved, and amen.